Pnawn da, croeso nôl. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Cymru Cymru Annual Conference. I hope you enjoyed the sessions earlier on today. We've had some fascinating presentations about trauma-informed approaches, and of course the element of that tied into this afternoon's session about supporting people who've experienced significant trauma as a refugee or asylum seeker. So today's session is all about Wales priding itself being a nation of sanctuary. We've heard numerous politicians proudly say that they want to welcome refugees here to this country. But of course, practicalities are important, and making sure that we're providing enough support for people to deal with some of the trauma they've experienced, and also practical things like housing and other types of support. So numerous individuals and organisations have responded to the recent calls to provide homes for people fleeing the war in Ukraine. But prior to this, Wales have welcomed Afghan refugees and Syrian refugees, and organisations such as Housing Justice Cymru have played a key role in supporting this work. In this session, we're really pleased to be hearing from Housing Justice Cymru about their approach nationally, but also hear from some really fantastic work that's happened locally with representatives from EYST and Taff Housing, who will talk about their work with the housing sector and refugees and asylum seekers. And finally, it's a call to action. We all know that there are people out there suffering huge traumas who are fleeing countries experiencing war and other atrocities. And we're really lucky and privileged in the UK to be able to support. So today's also about that call to action and what we in our organisations can also do to support people in these situations. So first of all, I'm really delighted to introduce Bonnie Williams, who's the Director of Housing Justice Cymru. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. So this afternoon, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Housing Justice Cymru and why we're involved in this area, and hopefully to encourage others to join us in becoming the accommodation solutions for our pledge as a country to be a nation of sanctuary, and how now with the Ukrainian situation, it's more vital than ever that we are all looking at what more we can do to make sure that we can accommodate people across Wales. Because we know that actually a fragile immigration status, and particularly those with no recourse to public funds, can become some of the most vulnerable people in Wales. Not having access to benefits or being able to work means that people are often left to face exploitation, and the crimes facing those people are some of the most harmful crimes we have in the UK: sexual exploitation, human trafficking, modern day slavery. So I'm going to give you an overview of why we've got involved in this area and why we're so passionate about it. And then we're going to talk to Romy, who works with Housing Justice Cymru, one of my team, who leads on this work, and we'll talk more about the details of our service. And then, as Katie said, we'll be going to Auda and Tim, some of the partners that we work with that are doing excellent work on the ground that we're hoping we'll be able to replicate throughout Wales to see more organisations joining this plight. So I'm going to start this afternoon by just talking about Housing Justice Cymru, and to explain that we became involved in this area because as a nation of sanctuary, Wales committed to looking at the accommodation solutions and what we could do to help refugees and asylum seekers. So I'll go on to talk about the commissioned report and the outcomes and recommendations. And then Romy particularly will talk about the work that we're doing that's funded through Comic Relief and Welsh Government that enables us to implement the recommendations of this report. So as an organisation, we're a Christian charity, and our mission is to address homelessness and housing need. And we're a national organisation, but I lead the Welsh arm of the charity in Wales. And so the work that we're talking about today is part of our Seeking Sanctuary work. And so not only are we now supporting other organisations to help provide accommodation for people seeking sanctuary in Wales, but we're also now a hosting organisation in our own right. And as a result of that work and our position in this sector, we're now helping Welsh Government to develop the Homes for Ukraine scheme to ensure that it can replicate the standards that we would expect from hosting as it normally is. So in addition to this work, we also have Citadel, which is a rapid rehousing and tenancy sustainment project, where we have volunteers at the heart of that model, And that makes it a very affordable but very effective model. In Swansea, for example, in the last 12 months, we've been able to house 22 people into new tenancies that they've sustained for over a 12-month period. And that model, using volunteers, allows the person to feel the self-worth of somebody who's not paid, supporting them in that role, and then stay and link to that community because the volunteer is from the community. So we can see that's working really well. And then we also have our Faith and Affordable Housing Programme, which is a project that helps us to work with churches to identify derelict land and buildings to develop more affordable, particularly social housing in Wales. And that's at the other end of the spectrum from Citadel, where we're helping to increase the supply. So we're really, really passionate to be able to and proud to be able to support all sort of aspects there. So one of the things I'm going to cover before handing over to Romy is the Nation of Sanctuary Plan and the recommendations that came out of the Petch and Sterling report, which is the Welsh Government Commissioned report looking at how in Wales we can address the accommodation needs of asylum seekers and refugees. And as we can see with the Ukrainian situation now, a large part of the recommendations was to increase hosting, because hosting is one of the only options we've really got with a housing crisis with limited funding. And particularly now we've used a lot of our resources through the Syrian situation, the Afghanistan situation, and everybody in during the pandemic. So really now hosting is really coming to the forefront as a viable model for people in need. But we do know that hosting can also be hugely beneficial to both parties when we get it right. And that's our key mantra at the moment, particularly for government and partners working in this. We must get the hosting placements right in order to ensure that they are sustainable and effective for both parties. So we became involved in this area because this report that I'm referring to recommended us as an organisation, as a lead organisation in this work, recognising the Faith and Affordable Housing project that we have with churches and housing associations, hopefully looking at a longer term supply of more housing associations donating properties to rent for this cause. And it looked at our volunteer work and the number of volunteers we have and thought that we'd be well placed to take on this work. And finally, it looked at our successful hosting scheme in London and saw the corporate knowledge that we have that we're now able to bring to Wales to establish ourselves as the hosting organisation. So we are working to address those, and I'm going to pass on to my colleague Romy to talk about the details of how we've got involved and the work that we're developing. But as you can see here from the recommendations, there was a real need for increased hosting capacity, different forms of accommodation, because we know hosting is not for everybody, and importantly to look at the safeguarding and standards of hosting in Wales. And that's something that we're heavily involved in now. That was prior to the Ukrainian situation, will remain throughout the situation and long after. And although our thoughts and prayers remain with the people of Ukraine, we do hope to be able to provide sanctuary for those people in Wales and continue to provide sanctuary for other refugees and asylum seekers in the future. Thank you very much. I'm going to welcome Romy on and hand over now.
Hi, as Bonnie said, I'm the hosting programme coordinator for Housing Justice Cymru, and I'd like to thank the team at Cymru for inviting us to speak today and to join their wider conference. As Bonnie said, Housing Justice Cymru is the lead partner in 2 projects for people seeking sanctuary, and they have slightly different focuses, but in many ways they are inextricable. Our strand of the work in both projects is to strengthen the infrastructure for hosting people with fragile immigration status in private households in Wales and to build up a pool of hosts. Just to clarify the basics in terms of what hosting is. Hosting is a benevolent act whereby a household offers shelter to a destitute person. Hosts and guests are usually strangers coming together in a supported way, and even with support, this is a courageous thing for both parties to do. There's an end date set to avoid feelings of guilt or rejection and reassure everyone that there is a structure and the arrangement is not indefinite. Importantly, the person being supported does not pay anything to be hosted and is not asked to do any work in return. Housing Justice is making steady progress in terms of hosting, and we know how successful it can be from the extensive hosting project we manage in London. Firstly, the Welsh Government supports a Seeking Sanctuary partnership between the hosting organisations in Wales. In Swansea, there's an established and successful hosting scheme with EYST, which grew out of the warmth of local people many years ago. In Cardiff, Housing Justice Cymru has partnered with EYST to host people in need. There's also Home for You in Cardiff, which provides beds for people with no recourse to public funds in shared housing. And in Newport, we're working with the Gap Centre to establish a hosting scheme and just beginning work in Wrexham. Also some initial work on contingency hosting in other areas at this stage for respite or holiday stays. The other partnership is funded by Comic Relief through a Changemakers grant. It's a 3-year project which brings together partners from the housing sector with partners from the refugee and asylum sector. So we are delighted to be working with Welsh Refugee Council, Oasis Cardiff, Tai Pawb and the Woolwich. Each of these organisations brings particular experience and expertise to the project, so a breadth of support can be provided for people in need. Since the publication of the Petch and Sterling report, which Bonnie referred to, which recommended the strengthening of hosting provision, the housing landscape has changed for the categories of people we support. Many of the people who would previously have been in need of hosting have not been destitute as a result of the public health accommodation provided since March 2020, for which everyone is eligible regardless of immigration status. At the same time, in March 2020, the Home Office housing contractors were obliged to stop evicting people. Referrals to hosting projects have not returned to pre-pandemic levels, but we're working to put provision in place for when it is needed. Until March this year, the hosting community in the UK was relatively small. But then the Prime Minister used the word hosting in connection with the migration scheme for displaced people from Ukraine. And hosting charities received a huge number of inquiries from the public and the media, and suddenly everyone was talking about hosting. Housing Justice Cymru is not operating Homes for Ukraine placements. The scheme is different. The fundamental difference is that it's limited to people from Ukraine, and hosting charities would not discriminate on the basis of nationality. However, as Bonnie said, we are glad to be consulted about how hosting works. It makes sense for the government to draw on best practice, and we've collaborated on some documentation on this with other members of NACOM, which is a network of charities accommodating people with no recourse to public funds. Members of NACOM from across the UK meet regularly to share best practice. Organisations vary in size and scope, but each one is committed to putting in place as safe and secure a stay as possible. There are people from lots of countries seeking sanctuary in the UK, and they can become destitute for various reasons, finding themselves with no income and nowhere safe to sleep. Without leave to remain, there is no right to work or claim benefits, so people are left open to the risk of exploitation. Many people who have lodged an asylum claim, in other words, they've asked the UK government to recognise them as a refugee and allow them to remain, live in National Asylum Support Service accommodation, which is managed in Wales on behalf of the Home Office by Clear Springs Ready Homes. The accommodation is variable in standard, but provides a bed and a small weekly subsistence allowance. If an asylum claim is refused, a resident is given 21 days' notice to leave the accommodation. There are very few options open to someone made destitute in this way, so hosting can be a lifeline. There are also vulnerable migrants with no recourse to public funds outside of the asylum system. People who came to the UK on a spouse visa and whose relationship has broken down, for example, or who've lost the job on which their leave to remain was dependent, and people who've fallen through the European Union settlement scheme net, losing the rights they had when the UK withdrew from the European Union. Paradoxically, for some people, the grant of refugee status and leave to remain is an unsettled time in itself. Whilst breathing a sigh of relief, a new refugee must navigate the transition from the asylum support to mainstream housing benefits and employment. And the Home Office allows a 28-day grace period in which to do this, and Welsh Refugee Council take people through the process. And there can be times during that circumstance when hosting provides a bridge to a new life. Housing Justice Cymru requires host households to have gas safety checks, smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and to consider fire escape plans. And those are all checked out prior to a host being accepted onto a scheme. We require a DBS check on prospective hosts and take up personal references. And those matters are also dealt with before a host is accepted onto the scheme. And the household is visited as part of the process of approving a new host. Referring agencies, referring a prospective guest, take care to gain as much information as possible to make sure that the person does not have needs which would make accommodation in a volunteer household inappropriate. And throughout the stay, both host and guest receive ongoing support. Hosts receive training in safeguarding because many guests have experienced trauma. During a hosting stay, caseworkers will usually help the person to regularise their immigration status and work towards a future where they have eligibility to work, rent, claim benefits, apply for social housing. Under Homes for Ukraine, people will already have those eligibilities on arrival. In hosting, the person being supported will often have a destitution subsistence payment, so they do have cash for digital access, for food, for travel. There are also questions around how some contribution could be made to expenses for hosts, because we can't now assume that a household can absorb another person with negligible cost implications on the cost of living. On the Homes for Ukraine scheme, hosts are not out of pocket. The government in Westminster offers a payment of £350 a month to hosts. And it's also said that having Ukrainian guests in your home will not impact your single person's council tax discount, which is something people hosting people from other countries can lose out on. Homes for Ukraine asks sponsors to host their guests for a minimum of 6 months. And even if most of the placements last that long, it seems likely that in the autumn there will be families in need of social housing or private rental properties, possibly in areas of the country where there's already a lack of availability. While we welcome the surge of support for people from Ukraine, we need to recruit hosts who understand that they are part of an ongoing battle against destitution. This is a longer journey and involves stamina and commitment. It involves management of expectation and a reining in of any over-enthusiasm, because it isn't sustainable to provide intense support to a guest for a longer period. And breaks need to be built in with contingency arrangements so no one feels stuck. And a support system needs to be in place for both host and guests so they're not isolated, but they're part of a community. A lot of work is going into building a structure for hosting people seeking sanctuary from different countries in Wales, but the essential ingredient which will make it possible is kindness. We are relying on the kindness of Welsh people to welcome strangers into their homes. We need to spread the word so that as many people as possible in Wales hear about hosting and the huge impact that this kindness has on the lives of the guests. And we need to educate potential hosts about the needs of different groups of people. The Welsh Government has committed to becoming a nation of sanctuary, and the work of this project is part of that powerful movement of people, communities and organisations. The vision of the partnerships we work with is that vulnerable migrants in Wales will have access to accommodation and casework support, and that the spiral of destitution and exploitation can be broken in Wales. Thank you for listening. We're glad to welcome Awder Ahmed now, who can tell us about the work which Shertawi does with housing.
Thank you very much, Romy. Thanks all. Good afternoon. My name is Abder Ahmad. I am the Shertawi Project Officer from EYST, the Ethnic Minorities and Youth Support Team in Wales. I would like to first provide a brief about the Shertawi Project. It was founded officially in the year 2010 and was developed by Swansea City of Sanctuary and Swansea Asylum Seeker Support Charities, and now is run by the Ethnic Minorities and Youth Support Team Wales, EYST. We in Shertawi are grateful to everyone involved in and supported this project. Shertawi is a unique and person-focused project which provides accommodation for people who have become destitute because of their asylum claim. The guests are at critical points in their lives and have no resources to public funds. They cannot access benefits and are at risk. The only place they can turn to is projects like Shertawi. Having somewhere temporary but safe to stay allows people the space to move forward with their asylum cases. We work closely as a team to enable this to happen. Shertawi functions and survives on the generosity of volunteer hosts who offer a room in their home or who support the scheme in other ways, as Romy also mentions, such as donations or spreading the word, or through creative collaborations like the one from Pobble Housing Association, which I come to in later. From the beginning, the Shertawi has successfully managed to support 88 destitute asylum seekers. From these, each 1 in 4 were able to win their cases and get their leave to remain. Also, the project offers more than 2,500 bed nights annually. These are the nights where someone would have been literally sleeping on the street. Now I'll get about the collaboration between the Pobble Housing Association and Shertawi. Some highlights. Destitution projects across the country may have 2 models of accommodation, which are the hosting, we have already mentioned about, and Romy also talked about, and cross-subsidized accommodation. Typically, the accommodation is for a mixture of an asylum seeker and a refugee, with the rent from the refugee providing subsidy to make it possible for the asylum seeker. Example of this is in Swansea with the Shertawi project. It's the 2-bedroom flat in the city center owned by Pobble Housing Association, accommodating 2 guests, an asylum seeker and a newly granted refugee. We in Shertawi thank all the organizations and individuals, especially Pobble Housing Association, who have supported this idea and pilot scheme, which I can now proudly announce it as a successful scheme. And we are working with Pobble Housing Association to prepare and accommodate a 2nd, then a 3rd flat as well. Purpose of the Shertawi shared accommodation project to create more spaces for destitute asylum seekers and newly granted refugees, and to provide a more independent experience for asylum seekers who have been hosted for a while. Also, to provide a supported period for a new refugee to experience the responsibility of being a tenant and to find more long-term accommodation. Also to explore employment and educational opportunities. In this model, Pobble owns the flat and acts as a landlord, sets the rent and service charge for the refugee at the same level they would to anyone sharing the flat, but forgoes the rent for the asylum seeker, means only the service charge will be paid for the asylum seeker. Also, Pobble furnishes the flat and provides basic requirements. Shertawi offers support to the asylum seeker and the refugee based on a plan agreed with each one. Also, Shertawi pays the service charge, means utility bills for the asylum seeker. We appreciate that Pobble Housing Association is willing to roll out this model, and based on recent discussions, we will start a second shared flat, which we are working on currently, and additional one in a near future as well, means the third one. Hope and wish that other housing associations will be encouraged by Popple's initiative and offer and take similar steps. Great thanks to Popple Housing Association, and thanks everyone. Now I would like to hand over to my colleague Tim in Taff Housing. Thank you very much all.
Thank you, Ada, and good afternoon, everyone. Last year, we saw unprecedented action on the part of the UK government welcoming Afghans fleeing the regime change there, and currently the Homes for Ukraine and other initiatives are underway. To provide some context, I think it's helpful to reflect on what began in 2016 with the welcoming of the families that fled the Syrian conflict, and to review how some of the accomplishments that were achieved then can inform these current initiatives. The devastation and loss experienced by the families then is repeated in current times, sadly, particularly for many of those arriving from the Ukraine. It's difficult to imagine even imagine the impact that such an experience can have on an individual. Homes lost, communities destroyed or permanently changed, and infrastructure obliterated. However, the opportunity currently presented to us across the public, private and voluntary sectors is to participate in welcoming and creating a safe space for the Ukrainian families arriving in Wales. To this end, there are practical challenges which, with will, ingenuity and cooperation, should not seem insurmountable, as we discovered with the Afghan and Syrian schemes. The Afghan scheme, now in its 7th month, from the outset seemed equally daunting in the challenges it presented to the participating agencies involved, but through collaborative and multi-agency cooperation, it has worked with extremely positive results here in Wales. It called for some innovative thinking, as well as a flexing of our understanding of processes, how things should be done, or how things would have been done in the past, as well as the practical considerations around receiving and supporting and providing homes for the received families under the Afghan scheme. An equal emphasis has been placed on addressing the emotional, psychological and cultural integration needs of the families hosted, which I would like to share with a little bit more on presently. As with the Syrian conflict, we're seeing a similar movement of people in huge numbers to countries outside of Ukraine's borders. And similarly, many are taking the route out of Afghanistan to Pakistan, where they await their cases to be heard. The Syrian conflict saw millions stranded in a state of limbo, and most often for years before the asylum cases were heard and granted. And particularly with the Ukrainian initiatives, there is this time round an opportunity for us all to work together to try to avoid this kind of scenario this time round by participating in the programme. The Ukrainian initiatives underway, by their nature, offer a much wider scope for participation than the Syrian or the Afghan schemes, as this time round the locus of control is less centralised. All of us here in this room, whoever we represent, are invited to and have the opportunity to participate and contribute. Put simply, the number of families that we've received, that are received and given sanctuary within Wales is largely down to us working collectively together. It's helpful to reflect on how the Syrian families received have done since, as it shows what a positive impact on people's lives we could all make. We've seen extensive community integration as our families settled into their new lives in Wales. many entering permanent employment, children thriving both at school and in their community links, and a number are now currently at university. To the end of supporting resettlement, the goodwill and desire of community members to participate and contribute was tapped into. The volunteers that helped out with the Taff Syrian scheme have played a key role in befriending and mentoring the families and has had a significant impact on their resettlement journey. Very pleasingly, 2 of our volunteers have since progressed into full-time posts as part of the Taff support team. More recently, on the Afghan scheme, dozens of families have been welcomed to Wales, have been moved on to permanent homes across the country. 2 Afghan individuals progressed to the point that they were successful at interview and are now employed full-time on the same scheme. Whilst awaiting their placements, families stay in bridging accommodation, and this was seen as an opportunity to prepare the families whilst under the same roof as fully as possible for a future life in their new homes and communities. Part of the vision of what success would look like was that as well as addressing the practical needs such as health, finances, education and the like, was to focus deeply into 3 areas that to us seem to interlink and mutually reinforce each other, being emotional support, cultural orientation and integration, and cultural adjustment. And I hope you might find the next slides useful. For most guests, their hearts and minds are still focusing on the developments back in their home country and thinking of friends and family, and giving rise to survivor guilt and feelings that they should maybe risk returning to support them. We felt it imperative that staff took the time to build with our guests so as to go towards building trust, creating a space for people, if they so wished, to discuss their concerns or their worries and an emotional well-being. We provided discussions around a wide range of aspects of Welsh life and culture aimed to boost the family's familiarity with and expectations around living here in Wales. Such things as Welsh laws like child protection, role of social services, safeguarding, how the education system works. You know, it might be puzzling, for instance, that young children especially learn through play rather than sitting in front of a blackboard. Discussions around parenting, you know, and encouraging parents to embrace the new culture that their young children or that their children will be exposed to at school and through their new friendships. Encouraging families to move forward together to avoid a widening cultural gap between parents and children, which might develop. Customs and etiquette, equality and equity, how this is, what its meaning is, and how this is built into Welsh services and systems. The consistent message being that we are not saying that you need to change who you are, but we hope to equip you to feel more comfortable and included in Welsh society. These kind of initiatives, I think, could be used to relieve the burden on hosting families for the Ukrainian families they host. A longitudinal study by the University of Cincinnati demonstrates that cultural adjustment is a non-linear journey with its highs and lows. Taff have used this model and its findings to form a bedrock of what its support strategies should entail, and is used to inform both staff and also the service users alike. It's proved very successful in helping service users to self-identify where they are on their resettlement journey and to better manage the low periods that they're likely to experience. As you can see, it begins with the family leaving their native culture, going on that journey, which can take a considerable amount of time as they adapt until eventually, once again, they feel that that the new location that they move to is now their native culture. And we've seen our Syrian families go on this journey. I hope this Shared experiences has encouraged people in the room to feel more empowered and inspired to get actively involved with welcoming Ukrainians to Wales. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I'd like to welcome back Bonnie and Romy and Alda to the Q&A session. That was fascinating and I think gave us such insight into both national approaches and local approaches to supporting people, and a really important call to action there in terms of how everyone in this virtual room can play their part over the coming weeks, months and years. So we've got a few questions that have come in. So firstly, I think Romy and Bonnie, how important is it to you for the government leadership, whether that be UK government or Welsh government, in terms of the very strong message that they send to public services and to the public on this issue?
Shall I go ahead, Bonnie? You want to take that?
Okay, that's okay.
Can you repeat the question, Katie?
I was just asking how important the leadership is from government in terms of setting the tone and setting the call to action, and setting the culture, I guess, that means that we are a welcoming nation.
In my opinion, Welsh Government are doing a very good job in mitigating some of the potential problems that have come out of the approach from Westminster. The announcements came before decisions in some cases, and most unfortunately, a space was created quite quickly in which people could abuse the matching process, and that's a really chilling, if you like. It's very, very uncomfortable situation, and that space, I think, was a result of some comments and some announcements which came before thought. But fortunately now, in England and in Wales, certainly, the third sector is being properly consulted. So organisations who have experience in safeguarding, experience in matching, in host applications and so on, are being properly consulted and getting involved. And we've asked the Department for Levelling Up for a solid list of approved matching organisations, rather to filter out some of the ill-intentioned portals or the people who are abusing well-intentioned portals. But also, you know, there is, I think, still a need for some clearer packaging of information for the public, because there seems to be lots of different bits of information that don't quite stick together. And I think it's really important that we get that. But from Welsh Government, we are seeing a more measured approach.
Excellent. Thank you, Romy. Tim and Alda, I was wondering, how important has it been for your projects to have the support of public services and other organisations locally? It's not something that you can run just one organisation in isolation, is it? So how have you found the partnerships, whether it be from the third sector or public services locally? Tim, I don't know if you want to kick us off on that.
Yeah. It's been absolutely vital to the success of the scheme. You know, both on the Syrian and the Afghan schemes. We linked in with quite an array of agencies. You know, the DWP. We had key partners within the DWP, education team, health services, working very, very closely with and under the direction of the local authority. On the Afghan scheme, we've also linked in with the Home Office and the Wales Strategic Migration Partnership. And I think what's really good about this, which can be transferred to the welcoming Ukrainians, is that part of the collaboration has been done without additional costs. You know, no additional funding was needed for this. It was just a spirit of goodwill and cooperation, and a common end that we always all wanted to see.
And is that something that you've found as well, Alda? I know you've talked passionately about Pobble's contribution towards this, but I imagine you've been working with lots of other partners as well.
Yes, actually, within the cooperation with the Pobble itself, actually, it took like I was mentioned to the other colleagues before, it took like a year to establish this collaboration. So many people, many organizations have participated in this and put their inputs with thanks. Also, as a Shared TAWI, we are participating, as Romy mentioned, with the Housing Justice Cymru, Shared Deed, the GAP, and all the other organizations. Also, we have a participation with the, let's say, the local authorities. We are in continuous contact with them to get updates about the destitution and move outs and so on.
Brilliant, thanks, Alda.
Thank you.
And thinking about some of the circumstances in which some of the refugees and asylum seekers have come from, and the really great trauma that they've experienced, it's really important that the support that they get is really trauma informed, isn't it, Bonnie and Romy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think what we've learned from the evidence base around trauma in Wales over the last few years is that there are a couple of key things to mitigating trauma and helping people to overcome it. And the trauma that we're seeing refugees arrive with is a trauma that we hope people can overcome. So it's not a trauma necessarily from birth. It can be a trauma that's occurred because of the war and the need to flee and the need to be displaced into a different country. So actually, the key mitigating factors are that kind of community connection, so that involvement in the community that you're living in, and a trusted adult relationship for younger people particularly. So we know that actually, therefore, you know, third sector organisations, housing associations that are in and out of their communities, supporting organisations and volunteers are a really vital part of the picture to get people over the difficult adversity that they've had, make sure they're protected and not open to experience any more. And that's one of the things about the Ukraine situation, I suppose, is making sure that we have got those connections on the ground and that nobody ends up in a hosting placement or otherwise that goes awry. And only by having those kind of connections and a support network around people can we ensure that they remain safe and that they can overcome the trauma, not add to it.
And actually, you know, if we're encouraging action from housing associations, from third sector support providers who are actually pretty well versed in trauma generally, maybe not conflict trauma, but understand the impact of trauma, then, you know, potentially you've got quite a good kind of knowledge base there, at least a foundation for organisations to play an important role in supporting refugees and asylum seekers.
I think that's it. And I think that's, you know, what our call is today, call to action for everybody to really play that part. And I suppose the important thing that we've heard from Alda and Tim is what their organisations are doing here, and Pobble's role in helping Alda with accommodation, and Taff's role in actually helping people to resettle in really meaningful ways that then is mutually benefit for the resettlement, people being resettled, the communities and the organisation. And actually we can see that what Pobble's doing and Taff are doing are absolutely vital. And we could be replicating those. So in order to come back to your earlier question about the government and what we're seeing from government, you know, we need to see the encouragement, maybe pressure being put on housing associations to replicate this work. If it's happening and it's vital and it's working really well in some, why isn't it happening across the board? And that's what we need to see. We need to see people taking up their commitments to the Type How Deeds Not Words campaign, and making services, support and accommodation crucially available for people seeking sanctuary. Because while we're in a desperate situation now with Ukraine, this is something that is going to go on for us. So, as you say, Katie, if we can all look what more we could do, it would make a massive difference.
Definitely. And staying with the subject of trauma, Alda and Tim, you've clearly got some brilliant staff members, brilliant volunteers who are helping out with these schemes. But it can be really difficult for those providing the support, isn't it? Because they're hearing secondhand about quite traumatic incidents that they may not have, you know, experience of coping with. So how have you been supporting some of the staff and volunteers in the schemes to cope with that trauma?
Actually, concerning our project and the organization, we always encourage the staff to take care of their personal mental health, because yeah, all the cases are affecting us as well. So maybe through counseling sessions and counseling practice, we are trying to cope with the situation and what we face on daily basis.
Brilliant, thanks, Alda. And Tim, similar to you, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's an approach, a kind of an approach that we encourage staff to take, so that you know, we're thinking back to that cultural orientation curve. People are going on that journey. They are going to experience times of extreme frustration and possibly despair. So one way of kind of staff support helping themselves is to acknowledge that, you know, that the families that they're working with, you know, if we've done our job properly, that we have that trust and that rapport. But at the same time, then, because we are the people they trust, we're also the ones that they will vent their frustrations upon. So just being aware of that, I think, is a huge help for the staff to just take a step back from an emotive situation. You know, use their listening skills. You know, not feeling for the person, but empathizing with. You know, so all of those skills we instill in our team, and I think it helps us with looking at the service users' perspective as well. You know, I can think of instances where someone might be having a proper meltdown over a dripping tap, you know, and we can kind of talk them through this and say, okay, this isn't really about the dripping tap. You know, using that example, you know, let's just kind of look at what's happening, you know, around you at this moment. So, you know, that model, like I said, has been hugely helpful in managing expectations, managing emotions for both the staff and the service users.
Thanks, Tim. That's really interesting insight. And Bonnie and Romy, I guess it comes back to how governments and other public services support this activity and making sure that, you know, the organisations, I think, Romy, you were sort of saying that sometimes it's, you know, there's mixed messages, there's incomplete messages, there's lack of clarity sometimes. And it's really important for organisations that are putting themselves forward to take part, that they get the right information and support to help them through this, isn't it?
Yeah, and the families, a lot of families that had come forward to host, when they came to kind of introductory sessions to hear about the basics of hosting, they were glad to consider things like, what if your children overhear some quite distressing things? Your guest may be contacting somebody they're very worried about. There could be bereavement. They might be listening to the news a lot. Let's think about your own children as well as them and their family. And I think that was perhaps something that not all the potential host families had a chance to think through. So very important.
Definitely. And I wonder, again, Bonnie and or Romy, reflection really on, I guess there's been, you know, an outpouring of support and offers for people fleeing Ukraine that we've maybe not seen to the same extent when there've been conflicts in other countries, in other parts of the world. And what are your reflections really on, you know, what that kind of says about society and priorities, and maybe looking forward, kind of some of the barriers, the discrimination, the stigma that we need to break down to kind of value everyone's life regardless of where they're from and the colour of their skin?
I don't want to conjecture about the response to Ukraine, whether it's the geographical proximity. I don't want to conjecture about that, but I think let's hope that this understanding of hosting and of displaced people leads to further understanding and more people wanting to host through Shertawi, through Housing Justice Cymru, irrespective of nationality, but simply because there is somebody with nowhere else to go and they care about people from other countries. But I think, again, it's a local authority thing and a government thing. Let's make sure, for example, that a single person's council tax discount is not impacted according to the nationality of your guest, that an insurer or a mortgage lender doesn't alter the premiums on the basis of the nationality of your guest. And those things need spotting, need calling out, and need sorting out.
Absolutely agree. And Bonnie, you've mentioned the Deeds Not Words scheme earlier, haven't you? And I'm sure you've got some views on this as well.
Yeah, and I think to complement that approach that Romy's talking about there, we really do need to raise awareness of our commitments to nation of sanctuary and what that means. You know, we need to increase the understanding of what it means to be an asylum seeker, and the trauma and, you know, the desperation that people are facing. We need to proactively counteract the rhetoric that is in the media. And that's part of our, I think, should be part of our commitment as Welsh Government, creating a nation of sanctuary. And I think that we can see there has been, as you say, a heightened response now. So we need to learn from that and learn about the gaps that we have in our understanding of why people have responded the way they have now and not in the past, to make sure that we can learn from that for the future and use mechanisms like public bodies, public services and organisations that are funded and regulated by Welsh Government to do their part in fulfilling our commitments as a country, which will then start to help change public perceptions or misperceptions and conceptions as well. So I think there's a lot more that we need to do. And as you say, I think this situation has brought it to the forefront, and I hope that we can take away the silver linings.
I just add to that, Katie, as well. I think the public really are seeking to educate themselves about immigration status and eligibility. For example, somebody arriving from Ukraine with recourse to public funds, with the right to rent, the right to work and so on, and how massively different that is to somebody who you might refer to as a spontaneous arrival, somebody who comes in another way and has a marathon towards that kind of eligibility or that kind of immigration status. So this term refugee that we all use quite broadly actually encompasses some very, very different circumstances.
Definitely. And I think that's another thing that, you know, individuals who are here for this session can take away as well, is that kind of ongoing education about the differences in people's experiences and the differences in their entitlements when they do reach the UK. Tim and Alda, before we finish up, I guess, you know, we hear a lot about the really positive impact that your projects have had on the people who are the service users. But could you tell us about the positive impacts that it's had on you and your fellow colleagues and volunteers through your involvement in them?
Wow, yeah. Good question. I suppose for me, it's been the education. You know, it's working, you know, for the past nearly 6 years on both schemes, you know, the Syrian and the Afghan, has really broadened my horizons. It's probably changed me, you know, completely as a person as to how I use my perspective on situations, on people, on cultures. And 6 years on, I'm still learning. And I think, yeah, for the team generally, I think I think the whole experience, you know, everyone feels that they're doing something worthwhile on the team. We all feel that it is a privilege. You know, I'm glad to say that everyone on my team is glad to be doing what they were doing. You know, it's their vocation. You know, the fact that they're getting employed and paid for what they do is just the bonus.
Brilliant, thanks, Tim. And Alda, how about yourself? The kind of positives of being involved in these projects?
Yeah, actually, with my project especially, apart from the refugee in the Pobl Shertawi scheme, all the guests are destitute asylum seekers, means their cases has been rejected. They have no source of funds. They are homeless. So first, when they find a host, it will be a great reveal if we can find a host for them and they are hosted. And later, when their life changes, they are able to integrate again to the community, getting courses, ESOL classes, volunteer And then when the cases are changed, this is the big prize, actually, the biggest prize, because they were able to get, let's say, their leave to remain, their paper, and they were supported to have like legal aid and collect evidences for their cases and get their replies. So it's a great prize, actually. I cannot mention.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Alda and Tim.
Very much.
And I think as well, just to, if I can just add, you know, like you mentioned the leave to remain, Alda, what a lovely reward it was for myself and my staff to sit with a family after their 5 years, you know, stay in the UK. They've now got their leave to remain, and to sit and review with them and go through their whole story and their journey with them. You know, that was a huge reward for us.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you both for sharing those very personal reflections on that. And I think, you know, if that doesn't put a smile on people's faces and make them want to get involved in schemes like this and for their organisations to be involved, then I don't know what will. Bonnie, Romy, if you'd kind of, you know, offer your closing remarks really on, I guess, you know, your final kind of call to action and the vision of what you would like to see for Wales being that nation of sanctuary.
Certainly. So just to reiterate that we weren't involved in this area at all up until about a year ago. And here we are today supporting other organisations that host and find other solutions to accommodate people. And, you know, any organisation can go on that journey. It's you know, accommodating people with fragile immigration status is here to stay. They are some of the most vulnerable people in Wales. So please, you know, look within your organisation as to what you can do, because we can only be a nation of sanctuary if we're all part of it.
Fantastic. And Romy, any closing words from you?
Talk to your friends. If they've got a spare room, put them in touch.
Brilliant. Well, I think that was an absolutely fantastic session. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for coming along and sharing your expertise and your experiences. I think it's been a hugely valuable session that I think speaks to a really important range of issues and has some really clear calls to action there from, as Romy said, whether it's speaking to your friends and family or whether it's you taking individual steps or your organisations. There's a clear need out there, and I think it's important that we all play our part in that. So diolch yn fawr iawn to all of our panel members. You've been absolutely fantastic today. That was our last session of today's conference, but do join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock. We've got a session on supporting our workforce, overcoming fatigue and trauma of the pandemic, where we'll be hearing from the chair of the Workforce Task and Finish Group, Claire Budden, and a range of other guests. We're also delighted to be hearing from the Museum of Homelessness, who are a fantastic organisation doing brilliant activism and community work with people with lived experience. And then we'll finish with reflections from Charlotte Waite on public service innovation, mindset, cultural and psychological safety. I hope you've enjoyed today. I've certainly enjoyed today and especially that final session. And we hope to see you all tomorrow at 10 AM. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Diolch pawb.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much.